In the nighttime, a young black man is walking down a suburban street alone. He is on the phone talking to someone, joking about how confusing and creepy the area feels. After hanging up, he checks his phone to confirm an address. A car passes by, but later turns around and appears to follow the young man. Suspicious, the young man turns around and nervously walks away, but later notices that the door to the driver's side is open. A masked man suddenly emerges and knocks him out. He then drags the young man into the car's trunk and the scene cuts out. The film introduces Chris, a talented young African-American photographer. Chris is preparing to meet his white girlfriend's parents for the first time and spend the weekend at their home in the countryside. Chris is a bit uneasy about how his girlfriend's parents will treat him when they find out he is black. However, his girlfriend, Rose, assures him that there is nothing to worry about as her parents are not racists. During their drive to the family's countryside estate, they accidentally hit a deer and report the incident to the police. Upon their arrival, the policeman asks for Chris' ID, even though he was not the one driving. Rose intervenes and objects to the officer's request, insisting that Chris has done nothing wrong. The police officer eventually backs off and dismisses the incident. Upon arriving at the house, Chris is warmly received by Rose's parents, who then introduce themselves. Chris learns that Rose's father, Dean, is a neurosurgeon and her mother, Missy, is a psychiatrist who uses hypnosis to help people. Dean takes Chris for a tour of the estate, and he meets two African-American workers, Georgina, the housekeeper, and Walter, the family's groundskeeper. Dean proceeds to make a couple of defensive comments in regards to having black people as his workers, explaining he has no problem with the black community. Chris starts to gradually notice that the black workers at the estate are rather strange. Sometime later, Rose's younger brother Jeremy arrives. Over dinner, he proceeds to make a number of discomforting comments about black people. That night, Chris is unable to fall asleep and sneaks out of the house to smoke. Chris notices the groundskeeper Walter running straight from the woods towards him and veers off at the very last second. He then sees Georgina intensely gazing at her own reflection by the window. Startled by the incident, he proceeds back to the house. On his way, Missy interrupts him and cautions him against smoking. She then requests Chris to sit with her in the office for a little while. The two briefly chat about Chris' smoking habit and how hypnotism works. Moments later, Missy starts to question Chris about his late mother. Though reluctant to talk about it, Missy hypnotizes Chris through tapping a silver spoon on a cup, and Chris begins recounting the day that his mother died. He was sighted home watching TV and his mother was involved in a hit-and-run accident, but he could not move from his sit to call for help quick enough. Missy hypnotizes Chris and shows him how it was his fault that his mother died that day because he did nothing to help her. The next morning, Chris awakes from a dream startled. He heads out to take some pictures and approaches Walter to personally introduce himself. Walter proceeds to mention Rose and passionately praises her while laughing out loud in a strange manner. He then apologizes to Chris for scaring him that night and explains that he was just doing his exercise. Walter then proceeds with his work as Chris heads back to the house confused. Sometime later, Chris tells Rose that he suspects her mother hypnotized him that night, but he is unable to remember it clearly. He then points out how he finds Walter exhibiting hostile and weird behavioral traits. Rose offers to talk to her father about Walter, however, Chris dismisses it as just a minor issue. At the same time, dozens of wealthy white people arrive at the house for an annual family get-together. Rose introduces Chris to a couple of guests at the party. They all appear friendly and fascinated by him, though constantly throwing in remarks about him being black, which makes him uncomfortable. Chris notices a black man standing by himself and approaches him, stating how glad he feels to see another black man around. The young black man moves in a subtle manner and appears to talk in a rehearsed kind of way. He introduces himself as Logan King. But shortly after, an old woman interrupts them and takes Logan away to introduce him to other guests. Chris meets a blind art dealer named Jim Hudson, who takes interest in Chris' photography talent rather than his race. Sometime later, Chris goes back to the house and walks past some guests busy chatting among themselves. Once he leaves the room, everyone suddenly stops talking and appear to listen in on his movement upstairs. Chris finds his phone off and unplugged from the charger, though he recalls plugging it in a few hours before he left the house. Chris proceeds to phone his best friend Rod, a TSA officer at an airport. He informs Rod about the strange incidents in the house. Chris highlights how he finds it odd that all the black people around the area are servants, and they all behave in a strange manner. Rod cautions him about the family and explains how things could possibly take a turn for the worse. After the call, Georgina suddenly appears at the door. She admits to accidentally unplugging his phone while cleaning the table and apologizes to him. Chris and Georgina have an awkward small talk as Georgina gives Chris a loaded stare. Briefly nervous, tears drop from Georgina's face, and before she leaves, she tells Chris how Dean and Missy treat them so well, like they are part of the family. Chris goes back to the party, and the guests continue asking questions related to race. Chris secretly takes a picture of Logan. However, the phone's flash alerts Logan. Logan falls silent and his nose begins to bleed as he stares at Chris. Logan suddenly loses his composure and grabs Chris, asking him to get out. Jeremy restrains him and drags him away. Sometime later, Logan is eventually calmed down by psychiatrist Missy, and Dean claims that Logan experienced a slight seizure caused by the phone flash, which led to his aggression. Logan apologizes to Chris, and they all dismiss the incident as they proceed to the party. Chris and Rose go out for a walk in the woods, but Chris appears disturbed by the whole incident, refusing to believe that Logan really suffered from a seizure. He informs Rose how uncomfortable he has been feeling during his stay in the estate, and plans on leaving. Back in the party, Dean is holding an event where the guests are silently bidding for Chris. One of the guests, Jim Hudson, eventually bids the highest and is awarded Chris. Meanwhile, Chris and Rose plan to make up an excuse and leave the estate together. After nightfall, they head back home and the guests appear to have all left. Chris sends a picture of Logan, that he had earlier captured, to his friend Rod. Rod gives him a call, and through their conversation, Chris recalls that Logan is actually a man he has met before, and his real name is Andre Hayworth. However, everything about him, from his dressing to his behavior, is a lot different and odd, and he does not seem like himself. Rod attempts to convince Chris to leave immediately, but the call suddenly gets disconnected. Chris, however, has already made up his mind and insists on leaving right away with his girlfriend Rose. As Chris packs up his bag, he notices a door to a cupboard that has been left open and proceeds to look inside. He comes across a couple of photos of Rose with different black young people, including one with Rose and Walter, and another one with Rose and Georgina. Aware of the fact that Rose may also not be what she seems, Chris does not mention the photos to her, and they both head downstairs with their bags. On their way out, Rose's parents, along with Jeremy, interrupt them and inquire about their sudden decision to leave. Rose responds that Chris' dog fell sick and he must show up at the vet's early the next morning. Dean begins to tell Chris about life's philosophy and notions. Meanwhile, Chris desperately screams at Rose to give him the car keys, which appear to have suddenly gone missing from her bag. Shortly after, Rose reveals her true motives. It becomes apparent that she has been part of her family's plot against Chris all along. Chris attempts to escape, but Missy taps a silver spoon on a cup, hypnotizing him, and he drops down, unable to move. Meanwhile, Rod grows concerned when he is unable to reach Chris on his phone for hours. Rod then looks up on the internet about Andre Hayworth and discovers that he was reported missing, and his search was later canceled after his family failed to find any clues linked to his disappearance. It is revealed that Andre Hayworth is the young black man who was abducted at the suburban street in the beginning of the film. 2 days later, Rod decides to report Chris missing. He tells the officers about Andre Hayworth and shows them a picture, suspecting that black people are abducted and hypnotized to become slaves to the white people. However, the officers take it as a joke and laugh it off. Rod proceeds to carry out his own investigation. He eventually calls Rose and asks her about Chris' whereabouts. Rose initially pretends to know nothing about his disappearance, and claims that Chris left the estate 2 days ago after an argument broke out between them. However, Rod figures out that Rose is hiding something and attempts to secretly record her, but Rose eventually outsmarts him. Meanwhile, Chris awakes and finds himself strapped to a chair. In front of him is a TV that plays a video presentation featuring Rose's grandfather Roman, explaining that the family transplants the brains of white old people into black bodies, so that the old people can use their strong and healthy bodies to serve as hosts for them. He then points out that the consciousness of the black person used as the host remains in a sunken place, able to watch but helpless and trapped within one's own self. The screen switches from Roman to Jim Hudson. Jim informs Chris that he bid on him so that he can gain his sight and get Chris' unique artistic talents. Sometime later, Dean starts the surgery on Jim Hudson, as Jeremy collects Chris for the procedure. Upon untying the unconscious Chris from the chair, he sneaks up on Jeremy and strikes him on his head. It turns out Chris stuffed his ears with cotton he pulled from the chair, blocking the hypnotic commands used on him to make him temporarily lose consciousness. Chris then proceeds to stab Dean with the antlers of a deer mount. Shortly after, Missy attacks Chris, but he manages to overpower Missy and stabs her. Chris is about to escape on Jeremy's car, but accidentally hits Georgina. Filled with guilt and upon recalling his mother's death, Chris carries Georgina into the car. However, he discovers that Georgina had already undergone the brain switch procedure, and she is in fact Marianne, Rose's grandmother. She begins to aggressively hit Chris, leading them to crash. Georgina eventually dies from the crash, leaving Chris with severe injuries which slow him down, until Rose and Walter manage to catch up with him. Chris discovers that Walter is actually Roman, Rose's grandfather. Walter attacks Chris, but Chris manages to break Walter out of the hypnotism, using the phone's camera flash. Walter takes Rose's rifle and turns on her, eventually shooting her, and shortly after, turns the rifle on himself. Critically injured Rose attempts to shoot Chris but fails. Chris then starts to strangle Rose, but eventually, he is unable to bring himself to kill her. A police siren sounds from a distance, and it turns out to be Rod with the TSA car. They both leave together, as Rose bleeds to death on the driveway. Hope you've enjoyed today's recap. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.